So, in this introduction, I speak about the history behind the making of this work, which is also about my trajectory at the Villa de Koning and in the dual degree. Altogether, this makes me look at this object that I'm presenting as my graduation project as a sort of future ruin, which I present while performing the role of a sort of archaeologist who's telling a story through this object. As I have discussed with some of you already, when I started doing the dual degree, I was so amazed by all of the knowledge presented that I was not critical enough of my position as a dual degree artist. I knew after a while, as it was also pointed out to me, that I needed to position myself in a more contemporary context, and I struggled with this a lot during the second and the third years. I then started experimenting with other ways to work with text to bridge this gap between theory and practice using the framework of theory fiction. I was investigating how the same narratives could be presented through different media, or how parts of the same narratives could be assembled to construct different works. In the visual culture minor, for example, we were creating intentional future ruins, and I used the A and the hand text to imagine how the repetitions and changes of the text could give rise to patterns on the material I was working with, which was hair. I presented the ruin in the final collective publication using a very clean layout because I thought the work was already very conceptually loaded. But what I noticed afterwards is that I could have played more with the visuals I was using to present the publication to better contextualize the work as a ruin. At this point, I received a feedback from Sami during Competency Assessment 3 that I could use my position as a dual degree artist to explore how the forms of knowledge built in academia and art academies not only complement each other, but also stand in friction with one another. After that, I dove into books from Stuart Hall in Culture Studies and into speculative research, in the visual arts with the work of Burroughs and O'Sullivan on fictioning, and in the social sciences with a collection by Savransky et al. At this point, I was also very much interested on the work of the Canadian artist Michael Dudek, who was involved in the visual culture minor, and who also works between art and academia to envision and create a queer religion. I then decided to use the opportunity of my thesis research to bridge all of these interests and write about speculative research in the contemporary arts. Since this is a very broad field, I chose to focus on the artistic research of Dudek's The Religion Virus as a case study. What happened, however, is that when I started writing about their myth production, I began to realize the extent to which I was creating myths myself in the thesis analysis under a scientific context, by bridging all of these different literature, perspectives, work methods that I was bringing with me, and asking my reader to do this connective work with me while reading the text, which was almost like a knitting process for me, connecting all of these pieces while the parts of the text were themselves speaking about how parts of different discourses can be joined to create a new mythology. So, by analyzing pieces of material from the Religion Virus, once Michael does not keep full recordings of performances, and investigating the discursive formation of a mythology from the artworks, I imagined myself performing the role of a fictional archaeologist, as Em and I spoke about, following the tradition of Levi-Strauss within semiotics and academia, but then aiming to escape the binary formations which for him structured mythologies, and replacing them by a more contemporary view on myths, drawing on the work of Burroughs and O'Sullivan. Since I was working with the topics of artistic research and theory fiction, I began to look for ways in which I could bridge the divide between theory and practice, which I was required to present in my graduation project at Erasmus and at the Villa de Koning. At first, I thought about writing a fictional thesis as my practical work, and I thought about presenting the documentation of my whole artistic research which led me to the thesis, as I made, for example, many graphs, drawings, maps to visualize the concepts I was working with in a less linear and rigid way, and to connect them to write the research. But then, at some point I realized that since I was approaching the process of writing the thesis as my artistic research, then the thesis itself is my artistic practice. Still with the competency assessment 3 feedback in mind, I then decided to use my position as a dual degree student to approach my thesis as a work of theory fiction and a form of speculative research, by contextualizing it as a thesis at Erasmus University and as my practice project at the Willem de Kooning Academy. Applying the three categories of analysis I used to analyze the religion virus in my own work, this is what I see as the myth-science function of my research. To briefly recap, myth science is defined in the thesis, according to Burroughs and O'Sullivan, as the potential of fictioning practices to create alternative knowledge frames. After discussing many ideas on the presentation of this work with Martina Raponi, who was my practice supervisor and whom I knew from a theory fiction project from the visual culture minor, we imagined this book as an object, as a ruin, which symbolized all of the story of this process that I'm describing to you. My thesis departed from the research question of what semiotic resources are employed for the articulation of the religion virus mythology, and how does the deck draw on fictioning strategies for communicating the event in mythology as a discourse? But to create the myth book, I reversed this question, and departing from a finished thesis, I focused on the extent to which my research process was per se a speculative practice and a mythological creation. Not least regarding the creation of the research methodology, which I understand as a form of craft. In other words, I approached the book as a form of taking a critical stance at my own position as a sociologist and artist. In order to position the thesis as a mythological creation, I designed the book itself as a past futuristic ruin, using the layout of antique books in conjunction with a fictional map, which summarized the myth productions of each chapter. The map was made using semiotic tools based on union between the levels of the signifier, the signified, the sign, and the level of myth, created by each chapter of the book. However, to depart from a too structuralist position, I added to each of the visual representations the field of the reader's interpretation, which was consecutively more distorted to indicate the connective work I was asking the reader to perform with me throughout the book, but which also surpassed the limits of the page to indicate there are elements external to the book which permeate the narrative every time it is read by another reader. I drew on the insight from semiotics that meaning is relational, created from the repetition and change of elements, to conceptualize the map as a visual language whose elements were created in the thesis research. You can also see the shapes created by the map in the cover of the book. In order to symbolize the constructiveness of the discourse I present within the book's narrative, I also left the internal structure of the book, as the binding and the stitches which close the cover, visible in the book, contrasting with a few hidden structures. Gloves were made and used for the photos and a possible exhibition to position the book as an archaeological art object. Applying the three categories of analysis I used to analyze the religion virus in my work, this is what I see as the mythotechnesis function. To briefly recap, mythotechnesis is defined in the thesis according to Burroughs and O'Sullivan as the potential of the media to convey a story in itself or in connection with the reader. To conclude, the last category of discourse analysis I used in the thesis is mythopoiesis, which is defined by Burroughs and O'Sullivan as the new forms of perception created on the viewer who experiences a work. For me, the experience of making this work changed so much my perception of what an artwork is and my position as an artistic researcher, to be continued in my master's, that I would say this work had a mythopoietic function, which is one of the reasons I position it as a future ruin, because I know it also functions as a seed for me.